Welcome to the Kick-Ass Talks podcast. I'm your host, business and marketing mentor, Paula Hemmings. Thank you so much for joining me this week. So this week, I'm going to be talking to you about podcasting. Why podcasting? Well, because earlier this year, I kind of low-key undercover celebrated 1 year of podcasting. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to reflect on what I've learned with this milestone, and I thought I would share what I've learned with some of you. So first of all, I'll tell you why I started podcasting. And the reason I started podcasting, because I really loved listening to them. I'd learned so much from listening to other podcasts. I became a fan of the host, started stalking them on social media, connecting with them on Twitter, LinkedIn, that sort of stuff. I changed things because of listening to podcasts. So I'd listen to a podcast, I'd learn new little strategies, productivity hacks, that sort of stuff. And I would actually change things in my life due to listening to podcasts. My belief systems change in other areas because of listening to podcasts. I even brought things sometimes just because of listening to podcasts. For example, books. I often hear books being recommended in other podcasts. So I would actually take an action because of what I had heard on a podcast. And at other times, I was just simply inspired by the podcast that I heard. So I started thinking to myself, I know stuff. I've got something to share, and I don't mind the world hearing what I've got to say. And that part of it actually kind of excited me. Imagine I can talk my stuff and speak my stuff and share it to the world. That is actually kind of exciting, because normally I can just give my knowledge, opinion to clients, people who read my blog, people who are in my life, in my space. But with podcasting, the possibility of just speaking to people around the world, that was like, woohoo, I'd have some of that. Thank you very much. So I got started. So the lesson number one that I learned was that it actually wasn't simple. I'm laughing because I actually thought setting up a podcast was going to be really simple, but it wasn't as simple as I thought it was going to be. It was actually quite finicky. There was hosting packages that I had to choose from. There was graphics that needed to be made. I had to source royalty-free music. Intros and outros had to be made. And honestly, I think the experts just made it sound easy. You know, when you're sitting there listening, it just seems like you got like a person with their mic at their computer and they are just making this amazing podcast happen. But no, it definitely wasn't as easy as I thought. But eventually, through learning and taking on board advice and lots and lots of research, I got over that hurdle. And then lesson number 2 that I learned was editing. Podcasts need editing, and editing takes time. So I realized that I actually needed to get a podcast producer, and I needed to get editing software, and that could take up not a nice amount of time. It actually takes up a large chunk of time. I remember editing my first podcast myself, and it took me about 3 hours. Now the podcast itself took me about 30 minutes to record. It was an interview podcast. But then to actually edit it took 3 hours. That was a little bit soul destroying and heartbreaking, because I'm not a fan of the whole editing process. But eventually I added someone onto my team, a podcast editor named Honeyzel. And so I eventually got over that hurdle, and that editing side of things got all sorted, no longer for me to do, because it's not just editing the adding on the intro and the outro. There's the getting rid of the ums and the arms and background noises. Did you forget to turn your phone off and it accidentally rang in the background sort of thing? So there's lots to do. Also just sorting out, just random noises and stuff that's definitely not my department. So that was lesson number 2. Editing takes time. Lesson number 3 was a time investment was really needed. So I had to map out a decent amount of time to podcast, and it wasn't just a 15-minute job. Now some of my podcasts are about 15 minutes, but the whole process of putting out that 15 minutes was a lot longer than that. So you need to actually have a time commitment. And now I have an afternoon of podcasting where I would do a lot of podcasting related stuff all in the afternoon just to get out a weekly podcast. So lesson number 4 is that you actually need tenacity. Most podcasters quit by the 7th podcast. And to tell you the truth, I can kind of see why. Because there's so much that goes into it, and it isn't just, you just start doing some podcasting and you just all of a sudden get these amazing results and all these people following you and you get listeners from around the world. It takes time to build up, so you definitely need that staying power. Lesson number 5, and this was quite a nice positive lesson, is that I actually learnt stuff. So once I got into my podcasting groove, I started interviewing experts, and through interviewing these experts, I actually personally learned a lot of stuff. Like, for example, my morning routine that I now do, I learned that from speaking to people on my podcast. I learned about doing my morning meditation through, I think, was it with Joe Frost in one of my, Joe, I can't remember his surname, but I do apologize, Joe, if you're listening, but Joe, who told me about the meditation in the morning, I started doing that. I also remember speaking to Holly Luton in one of my very early episodes in a conversation with her and Phil Faulkner about just setting up morning routines, and she was telling me about her routines, and that inspired me to create my own morning routine, and that's something that I have now implemented into my life. So through listening to these experts, I actually was also learning stuff, so that was brilliant, and I had these great conversations, which leads nicely onto lesson number 6, was I developed new relationships with people around the world. How amazing is that? So some of the people that I spoke to I spoke to Sanez, who was the how to get booked as a TEDx speaker expert. She's based in Japan. I spoke to Louis Lavella, who was based in Canada, the music personal branding superstar. I spoke to Audrey Richmond and Senna Williams, who in the US of A. And I spoke to many other people like my good friend now, Petra Foster, and Phil and Holly and numerous others who are based in the UK. And the great thing about this is that some of these people are now my friends off the back of me interviewing them for my podcast. So that was a great positive out of me doing this podcasting. So lesson number 7 is my favorite number, but people actually listen to my podcast. Like, woohoo! People listened, because I look at my podcast stats, and people listen to my podcast, every single podcast. There's never been a podcast where nobody hasn't listened. And that's great, because yes, we all want these big numbers, but somebody's always listening, which is amazing. So for whoever's listening right now, thank you so much for listening. I know I say it in every single podcast, and it's not just because I need to fill some air and I need to think of something to say. You can probably see that is not my problem. I always have something to say. But do really thank you so much for listening, because you do not have to listen to this podcast. There's hundreds and hundreds, thousands of other podcasts that you could be listening to, but you chose to listen to me. So thank you so much. So yes, that was number 7. People listen to my podcast. Lesson number 8 was it's really easy to fall off the podcasting bandwagon. It's really easy. Trust me, it's happened to me. And if you do not schedule the time to make the podcast happen, then it's quite likely that the podcast actually will not record themselves. So you have to make it part of your diary. And if podcasting is something that you are thinking about doing, make sure you just schedule that time in and actually make it happen. Lesson number 9, which relates quite nicely to lesson number 8, is that I didn't show up every week, and this affected my numbers. There's some weeks where I just didn't put out a podcast. It took me a while to get into the rhythm of getting the podcast done, and it's not too far away in history of me not putting a podcast every week. It's only now that I'm really becoming consistent with it. So I can't pretend to be like perfect with it. I definitely haven't been. I definitely didn't show up every week. So do need to be consistent, but also when you're not consistent with it, don't beat yourself up. Just jump back on the horse and get podcasting again. Lesson number 10, again, this relates so nicely, like, oh, Paula, with this planning, is that consistency pays off. So the more I podcast, the more people listen. And I also learned that some shows were crap, but people still listened. I also learned, this is all within lesson number 10, that the more I recorded, the better I became. It was great for branding, it's great for marketing, and I will continue to podcast until it just no longer serves me and it no longer helps me reach my goals. So if podcasting is something that you are thinking about doing, do take on board these lessons that I've shared with you today. It isn't as simple as it seems to be, but it is great being able to help people. I've had people tweet me that have listened to my podcast, and that's quite nice. I mean, it's quite a nice little ego boost, actually. It's really cool just knowing that people are out there listening and learning from the podcast. So I've received the same kind of stuff from other podcasts, and I'm happy to give my knowledge and my expertise to my audience on my podcast. So if you are interested in learning more about podcasting, my next masterclass in the Kick-Ass Entrepreneurs Club is actually on podcasting, taking you through the whole process of actually creating your podcast, planning for your podcast, naming your podcast, branding your podcast, finding hosting for your podcast, submitting to iTunes, and a whole load more. So do check out the kaentrepreneurs.co.uk if you want to find out more about this masterclass. You also feel free to tweet me at Paula Hemmings, find me on Instagram at Paula Hemmings, join the Facebook group. The links are all going to be in the show notes. I would love to connect with you. If you're not interested in podcasting and you just want to say hello to me, please do reach out and say, hi Paula, I've actually listened to your podcast. I'm one of those listeners. Holla at me, do let me know. And that's it for this week. So next week I will be back again, and I'll be talking a little bit more about podcasting once again, because I want to tell you actually why you should use podcasting to market your business, because it's something that can help your business to grow. So do tune in again next week. Thank you again for joining me, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Do you need help and support with the marketing and business strategy in your business? Join the exclusive membership club, the Kick-Ass Entrepreneurs Club, for entrepreneurs who want unlimited email support, monthly masterclasses, guest speaker workshops, mastermind sessions, accountability bodies, unlimited email support, access to resource library, and much more. Check out the kaentrepreneurs.co.uk. That's kaentrepreneurs.co.uk. I'll see you there.